Hi everyone, I am Danette Blair, and we are going to make a long fermentation yeast loaf tonight. So it looks like sourdough, ferments like sourdough, but there's no sourdough starter. So you don't have to keep that little jar alive and feed it every day or twice a day and hopefully not kill it. So with that, we're just going to kind of jump in. I've been baking bread since I was a little itty bitty girl, even won a few ribbons and some recognition from 4-H for my loaves of bread. And I just grew up in a farm community, and everyone in our family baked. My grandmother worked in a bakery. My mom and dad both baked breads. And so working with dough just is something that I have grown up doing. And back in like the 70s and 80s, we were doing sourdough back then and yeast breads. And then somehow sourdough just kind of went by the wayside. And a few years ago, I picked it back up. And then all of a sudden, COVID hit and sourdough just became like the rage. I think people just got bored or something, or they needed something to take care of during COVID. And so sourdough had this resurgence, but now we've all kind of gone back to our busy lives, and keeping a sourdough starter alive isn't what everybody wants to do. So I still love making sourdough, but I also love making yeast breads. And I have found that the superpower of sourdough is that long fermentation, and you can do the same thing with yeast. Here in America, we like things really quick. So we add in a whole lot of yeast into our bread dough and it will get a really fast rise, but you don't have to. You can add just a little pinch and it will leaven the whole dough in 8 to 12 hours. So that's what we are going to learn tonight. And we're going to kind of just jump right in because our dough needs to rest. And while it rests, we'll talk about all the ingredients and all the things. So the recipe that I sent you is just a very basic loaf. It's an artisan loaf. It looks a lot like sourdough. This is kind of on the smaller size. So it's perfect for for just to keep on the counter for a couple days, because we all know that when we don't have all the extra stuff in there, bread should only last 1 to 2 days, and then either get it in the freezer or feed it to the birds or what have you. Make it into some bread pudding. That's always my favorite. Okay, so first up is flour. And for this artisan loaf, we are going to use bread flour. But if you don't have bread flour, use all-purpose flour. And I like to give it a little stir. Since I'm going to teach you using cups instead of a food scale, but I gave you the measurements so you can do whichever is your favorite. But we're going to keep this really simple. And since not everyone has a food scale, we're going to go with cup measurements. And when I'm doing cup measurements, I always give my flour a little stir, get some air in there. You can use a whisk, you can use a fork, what have you. You just don't want your flour packed down. And you also don't want to scoop down in there because that will pack your flour. So we're going to need 3 cups of flour. And I just lightly put it in here. This way it'll be between like 125, 130 grams of flour per cup. And scrape it off with a flat side. So we got 1. And 2. Now, white flour, even if it's unbleached, doesn't have much flavor to it. You've ever just tasted plain flour, it's just kind of gross. So this is where adding something in like a whole wheat flour or spelt flour, which spelt is just a variety of wheat. But adding something in that is a whole grain is going to give it a little bit more flavor, but you don't need a whole lot. If I did all of this, it would end up becoming a very dense dough. So we're just going to do half a cup of the spelt. And that will give it a nice flavor. And because flavor, there's not many ingredients in here, we need a lot of salt. It seems like a lot of salt, but this is like really the only flavoring besides a little bit of that whole wheat. So I add in 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and this is just kosher salt. You can get real fancy with your salts, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but kosher salt works great. And then when it comes to yeast, because we're adding our yeast directly to the flour, we're going to use an instant dry yeast, and we are just going to use 1/4 teaspoon. A packet of yeast has 2.5 teaspoons, and that's what's typically used for a loaf of bread. So you can tell we're just using like a very small fraction of the yeast that would be in a normal loaf of bread. So stir all those things together and make like a little well in the middle. And we're going to put in 1.5 cups of water. And then I like to start in the center, and it's going to seem really wet and like a slurry. But as it starts absorbing the flour, it's going to turn into a rough dough, or what a lot of bakers call a shaggy dough. And you will notice that it actually looks shaggy. I mean, that's why how it got its names, because it looks just like it sounds. And I think
Are you only using 1/4 teaspoon of the yeast because you're making a small loaf? Is that why?
I'm using a 1/4 teaspoon because we are going to let this do a long fermentation process. So if I put in the 2.5 teaspoons that would be like in a packet of yeast, this would be ready in an hour. And we'll talk tomorrow a little bit more about why that long fermentation is better for like our digestion. When we rush things, it doesn't have time to break down the gluten in the dough. And so we want this to be easily digested. So that long fermentation is going to really help with that. So then I like to go in with my hand and just give it a little bit, make sure all the dry is absorbed in there. And then we're just going to cover it and let it sit here for about, I don't know, 20 minutes. I usually will give it 30 minutes. So I like to make this right before I go to bed. And then I will go to the bathroom, get my pajamas on, brush my teeth, wash my face. And after about that time, it's been about 25, 30 minutes. And then we'll do our next stage, which is a stretch and fold. And then I put it to bed and let it sit all night. And then the next morning I bake it off. You can also do this, like if you wake up early in the morning, come out here, you can see that only took like 5-10 minutes max, and then go get ready for work. And then before you walk out the door to work, do a few stretch and folds and then put it to bed. And it'll be ready for you to do the next step when you get home from work. So timing wise, this is a really easy loaf. So let me wash my fingers off real quick and we'll let it rest. So I just want to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk a little bit about flours, because there's a lot of confusion out there about which flours to use for bread. And for this loaf, I put bread flour on the ingredient list, but you can absolutely use all-purpose flour. But not all flours are identical. So I sent my husband to the store, told him to get me a bag of flour, and he came back with some unbleached regular flour. And and I was like, oh, that's not quite what I was looking for. But if this is what you have, great. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to look at the ingredient list on this. Where is it at? Ingredients: unbleached enriched wheat flour. And then they've added niacin, reduced iron, thiamine, some words I can't pronounce, riboflavin, folic acids, and enzymes. So that's the enriched part. They've added in a bunch of vitamins and minerals and stuff. And what I'm looking for is I just would like plain wheat, nothing else on the ingredient list. And this brand is our, not everybody has an HB, and I'm so sorry, but Our store brand is just organic wheat flour. That's the only thing on the ingredient list on this one. Another one really popular with bread bakers is King Arthur. And King Arthur adds in an enzyme, which really helps with breaking down the gluten and just that structure. And so King Arthur is a great brand of flours. So you can do all purpose. And then the one that we use is bread flour. It's the partner to this one. Also take a look. So I had this one in the cabinet, and this is self-rising. And that sounds great, but self-rising already has the baking soda and baking powder in it. So it's great for biscuits and pancakes and that kind of stuff. So that serves its purpose, but not in bread baking. So then let's talk a little bit about yeast. Most commercial yeast that we're going to find in our grocery stores come in two varieties. One is instant, which is what we used. Instant can be added straight to your flours and with your dough, and you just mix it right in. And the other is active dry yeast. And the word that should clue you in is the active word. It means it needs to be activated. And so you have to put it in water with a little bit of like sugar or honey. So if you have that in your cabinet, go ahead and do the recipe, but put your yeast in the water, stir that up, put in a little pinch of sugar or a little dollop of honey just to activate it and let it set for 5 minutes. And it should get a little bit of foam on top, and then put that into your flours. It's not as predictable as instant yeast. Instant yeast is very stable. And so that's the one that I typically have in my pantry and use in my bread doughs. It's just easy. It always works. So it might say, like mine says, dry yeast on it, but that has the word instant. But if it had the word active, then I would know that I need to activate it and put it in some water and sugar and give it a little food and wake it up. Let's talk salts. I have an entire cabinet of just salts, and most everybody can get kosher salt. I steer clear of table salt. I just don't feel like it has a lot of flavor. And if salt really is like your only true flavoring in your bread, you want it to be a salt that you really, really enjoy. And so a lot of the mineral salts like the Maldon or the Celtic salts are great for using bread. I do a French salt. It's like a French sea salt, pink Himalayan, anything that you really enjoy using on your food goes great in bread. You don't want it to be too coarse because you do want it to kind of melt into your bread. And so if it's a little bit smaller grain, that'll work great. But kosher salt is something I always keep on my counter. So that's what we used in the bread dough tonight. So let's talk a little bit about why I just really love this process. I mean, we already talked about the fact that you don't have to keep a sourdough starter alive. I think most people think that if they want healthy bread made at home, it needs to be sourdough. And then I have found that that's not the case, that if we take the time to do this long fermentation process, that we can get a very digestible loaf of bread. Now, here's the crazy thing. There really wasn't much research on sourdough until COVID hit. And then everybody became very interested in it, including scientists, and they started. So if you start looking up long fermentation process, you don't find a lot of research, but what you find is a lot of great information from longtime bakers and information passed down from generation to generation from bakers about how this process is the way that they grew up making bread in the olden days. And I really feel like bread has gotten a bad rap because we have adulterated the process. And so if we slow down and go back to the way things used to be, maybe we can find a way for bread to be a more natural part of our diet. That said, there are some other things that we can do to make bread a little bit more digestible. And we'll get into more of that tomorrow. But another one is taking it to this deep golden brown. A lot of times, especially our American breads, we pull them when they're white because we like white bread. But if we can take it, so especially this ear gets really dark, bread that's well done is more digestible than bread. Think Wonder Bread. Like that'll stay in your stomach and be all gummy. Though I do, if you're gonna have a peanut butter and jelly, Wonder Bread. Let's see. Let's also talk about let's see, equipment. As you can tell, I tried to keep this really simple. We have a bowl, we have a spoon, we have some measuring cups. We didn't use the scale, but if you want to invest in that, you can. But other than that, you really don't need a whole lot of equipment to make bread. I do most of mine just in this bowl, and my hands end up being one of the best tools. The other thing I like to tell people is commit to, especially if you're a brand new baker, commit to making 7 loaves before you throw in the towel. I can't tell you how many loaves of bread, even at this stage, after being a baker for 50 years, where I still will have some mishaps and the birds get the bread instead of my family. So make sure that, if you make 1 loaf and you're like, I'm not sure I'm very good at this, commit to 7 loaves before you throw in the towel. Will you do me that? And make sure you reach out to me if you feel like you need just a little bit of assistance. And then the other thing I'm going to talk about is we really need to let go of the stress of having that perfectly curated, beautiful loaf. Sometimes bread comes out, it's a little bit unpredictable. It comes out of the oven and it'll be a little wonky looking, but you know what? It still tastes amazing. So I want to make sure don't get hung up on how it looks as much as how it tastes and how much and just the enjoyment of having bread. Okay, I think that's all the information I have for you guys tonight. So we're just going to move right into our next step, which is stretch and folds. So our dough's been sitting, and with stretch and folds, it's exactly like it sounds, is you grab one side, you pull, and you fold it over. Then you turn your bowl and you stretch and you fold it over. And now you can tell when I pull, it's going to start, if I pull too much, it's going to start coming apart right there. That's because we haven't built any structure into our bread dough yet. And so we are going to keep stretching and folding this particular loaf until it almost won't stretch anymore. And that could take anywhere from 4 to 20 stretches. So keep stretching. So it's already starting to have less give. And I just keep going until I can hardly pull it up anymore. And you'll also notice it was shaggy looking. And as we do this, it's going to smooth out. And that's exactly what we want it to do. So we're probably at like a dozen stretch and folds. Yeah, I'm gonna give it a couple more. And that's all there is to that. This is what we call a bench scraper. You don't need one. I just find them very handy. So I get it into a ball right there. And then this, I'm going to leave on the counter. I'm either going to put a piece of saran wrap on top, or I'm going to get this towel damp and throw it on top. And I let this sit anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. So we're going to put that guy to bed. And then this one I made this morning. And I really want you guys to see this. So I'm going to come close. So this dough has been sitting think we're at 10 hours now. And this is what you want. You want to see some bubbles on top. If you give it a little shake, you want to see it jiggle. And you can tell that little blob that we put back there is now this big mass, same recipe. And so this has lots of air built into it. And we're gonna use that same bench scraper. And I'm just gonna get it out on the counter. If you are not baking a lot and aren't real familiar with handling dough, you can flour your surface. That would make it a little bit easier to handle. I try not to add too much extra flour in, but do what you need to do to get started. Let me see if I can turn my camera down so you can see this a little bit better. There you go. So when I'm got my blob here on the counter, you're gonna pull and fold it over like you were writing a letter. I don't know how many people write letters anymore, but we used to on the lined paper when you would write a letter to your grandma and you'd fold it in thirds. That's what you're doing with this dough. You're going in thirds, then you're gonna roll it up, flop it on your counter, and then you're gonna cover it and let it rest for, what did I write on your recipe? 10, 15 minutes. And that rest time just gives it time to relax now that you've taken it out of the bowl and you've kind of handled it. And then your next step, after you've let it set for 15 minutes, is to literally do the exact same thing. So I flip it back over, I stretch it out, and I do that letter fold. So fold it over, and then you're gonna roll it. And you can tell this is a little bit sticky. So if you're not super familiar with handling sticky dough, go ahead and flour your hands and flour your surface. It'll really help. Especially since, I'm gonna grab a little bit, because this is sticky. Roll it, and then I kind of just get it in a little ball. This will be less sticky if we would have let it sit the 15 minutes. But I wasn't going to make you sit there and watch just a blob of dough for 15 minutes. So there you go. Once this is like this, then I put it on a piece of parchment paper and I let it set for 30 to 60 minutes. 30 minutes if it's the middle of summer and it's 72 degrees in my house. 60 minutes if it's the winter and it's 68 degrees in my house. Kind of play it by ear. But with 30 minutes before I throw this in the oven, I'm going to preheat my oven. And I'm going to put if you have a Dutch oven or a soup pot, put this in the oven when you preheat it, and this thing will get scorching hot. And then this goes on a piece of parchment paper, and you literally pick up the parchment paper, plop it down into your really hot Dutch oven, which we can do that. Let me grab a piece of parchment. I love buying these like pre-cut ones from Amazon. They just make my life so much easier. They fit like a cookie sheet. All right, so let's pretend this has been sitting for 60 minutes. It's ready to go in the oven. What I will do is grab a razor blade or a sharp knife if I want, and I do like a little score so I can get an ear. With this bread, you don't have to do that. It will kind of crack open on the top, which is kind of a cool look. Super hot, so super hot Dutch oven is what you want. You're gonna set this down in there, and then I grab a couple ice cubes and I put them down underneath the parchment, and that's going to create steam inside your Dutch oven. What we're doing is we're making an itty bitty oven so that it all stays in one. It will expand into this beautiful round instead of out and flat. This recipe you can do on a cookie sheet if you don't have a Dutch oven. You you'll just kind of have to play around with the best techniques for that, and we can talk that through. So then this goes in the oven. I do 20 minutes with the lid on. Then we're gonna take the lid off, let the steam escape, and let it continue baking for another 20 minutes. At that point, I'm gonna check it. And what I'm looking for is it to the color that I want? Because remember, we want that little bit darker golden color because we want our bread to be well done. And I don't know if this will do it because this one's already out of the oven. But if you tap it on the bottom, you want it to have a really hollow sound. And if it sounds kind of muted, then give it another 5-10 minutes. And I will either leave it in the Dutch oven at that point or just do it right on the rack of the oven. And then when you take your bread out, you're going to put it on a cooling rack and let it sit for 30 minutes at least. If you cut into really hot bread, all of that steam that's in there, instead of still cooking the bread, it will actually make your bread really gummy on the inside. It'll be like my fingers. So make sure you let it sit for 30 minutes. Is the hardest part of baking bread is letting it sit and cool down before you slice into it. And then slap some butter on it. And so with that, let's see. What questions do you guys? Oh my gosh, we've done great on time. I'm not going to keep you all night. This is great. What questions do you have? Go for it, Meredith.
So if you have the not the instant yeast,
Uh-huh.
how much of it, like once you do the process to activate it, are you still only using a quarter teaspoon or are you using more?
Just a quarter teaspoon.
So just activate a quarter teaspoon, like to start.
Yep.
And then whatever that turns, because you're adding water and that kind of stuff. So all that will be what you add.
Yep.
Okay.
That will work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jeanette,
Yeah.
this is Kathy. I have a question. So say in the morning when it's been 12 hours and I can do the first shape and let it rest for 15 minutes, and then shape it again, but I might not have time to bake it before I head off to the office. So could I hold it in the fridge, like in a bowl or something, until I can bake it in the evening?
Yes. So I have done a cold proof with this one.
Uh-huh.
And I put it in, I have some of the sourdough baskets, and that's usually what I do.
Yes.
Put it in. So
Okay.
yeah, I would do that
Okay.
and just
Okay.
cover it and let it hang out in the fridge until you pull it. And then I would let it, warm up for about 30 minutes or pull it out while your oven's preheating and you should be good.
Okay, perfect. We'll see how this one works because I only had the active dry yeast and I didn't catch the special instructions before we mixed it together.
Oh, you know what? And it might turn out fine.
I
You know,
added a little more water to the
less-
dough. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
oh no, you're fine. It's just a little less predictable. So it may turn out just fine.
And I gave it a little squirt of honey, so we'll see what happens.
That'll work. Do you guys have any other questions?
Do you find that the weighing of things versus the measuring, like cup wise, actually works better?
It's more consistent. So you're gonna just get more consistent results if you're weighing because you're gonna have the exact amount of flour and stuff. But even then, like my flours from bag to bag, and depending on just like the environment or whatever, sometimes they absorb more of the liquid and it feels a little dry, and then other times it's like tonight it was a little sticky. So you just, yeah, I find it's a little bit more predictable with the scale, but even then, you just, depending on the flours and the grains, like I have a whole wheat flour that I love to use, but it's super thirsty. And so I always know to kind of like back off on that whole wheat flour where the spelt one is a little bit more, um, it acts more like the bread flour. And that's just through trial and error and baking that you learn all that.
And if like when you were mixing it, yours was wetter, you said in that batch. If it were a little drier, like if all the flour weren't, say, incorporating because it was still drier, would you add more water?
I would. I don't usually like if it's a little sticky, I don't add more flour. I just deal with the stickiness because that's just going to give you lots of hydration in your bread dough. But if it is drier, then I will add a little bit more water.
Jeanette, do you find, does the weather outside affect your bread?
It
Like if it's
does.
real humid,
Um,
how does it affect it?
I have found that like if it's a cold, damp, rainy day, it just
Mm-hmm.
acts a little different. It needs a little bit of time in the oven. It might not, it like will get like, I don't know, just kind of flatten out a little bit. It's just funny to just as to how the weather that I should really write down, like keep a little journal, a little bread
Yeah,
journal on how it behaves because it does um make a difference. I
yeah.
think most of the time what I notice is the rise times. So if it's dry and hot, like sometimes my bread dough will rise so quickly that I'm afraid it's going to overproof and I have to, jump on it. And then other times, uh, like even today, it was so cold. It was kind of colder and a little bit more windy. And I kept checking my bread dough because I was like, I don't know, I gotta make sure this is going to be bubbly by the time we do our class. So, and I had made another bread dough earlier today that wasn't a long ferment, and it just, I don't know, it just didn't turn out. And I was like, it's just one of those things that when the weather changes, you just kind of have to feel it out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hmm.
I feel like I'm gonna go through a lot of flour if I'm committing to 7.
Well, at least this is a smaller loaf. This is only what, like 400 grams of flour.
So
So
7 loaves, that's 21 cups of flour to make that loaf 7
you don't
times.
have to make it all in one week. You could spread that out over like once a month if you wanted to. So tomorrow night we are going to make a sandwich loaf, which is really similar. The recipe is super similar to this one. Um, but it's one that you can slice and make into toast and sandwiches. And we will have a little discussion on digestion and gut health and how bread fits in with all of that. So I'm looking forward to that. Um, do you guys have any more questions? And if not, I can let you go. Kathy, did you have something?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say I'm looking forward to tomorrow's session then with the digestion discussion.
Yeah.
Always good to know more.
Yeah. I wish I knew nothing about it, but I know probably too much just because I've had digestive issues for a good long while. And it wasn't until um, I started hanging around with people who like understood what food does to the body that I was like, oh, maybe it's something eating.
Cool.
I know. It's been an interesting, like it's been about 15 years of elimination diets and this and that and the other thing. And now after the last 2 or 3 years of really working on my gut health, I'm back to eating all the things that I was told I would never eat again. So, and bread being one of them. So
Wow, that's awesome.
I, it is. I know that's not everybody's story, um, but I think we can learn a lot from each other by sharing our stories.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna turn my camera back up so I don't have to keep squatting. All right, you guys, I will let you go. Thanks for hanging out with me, and we will make another loaf tomorrow.